In the coming weeks, we stand at one of the most fundamental thresholds of our new beginning. It is about truly total changes. And this happens very, very rarely to this extent. However, whenever such an event occurs, a shift in consciousness is essential both personally and collectively. And this is usually accompanied by a spiritual awakening in many people. Thus, it is no wonder that letting go, change, confusion, and perhaps even chaos come into focus. For the path of spiritual awakening leads not only to your fears and attachment patterns, but also to the self-images you have acquired throughout your life. Often, this happens unconsciously, without you even realizing it. But now, on the threshold of a new beginning, a completely natural ability of your brain is being thrown into disarray. And this is a fundamental step in the spiritual awakening. This is what today's podcast episode is about. Hello, my name is Linda Giza. I have been a spiritual mentor for over 20 years. I am the author of the book Consciousness Next Level and the founder of the Being Potential method. Being potentials are your strengths. They are the compass given to you for this life to live in abundance, prosperity, freedom, fulfillment, and much more, including happy relationships and so on. And if you want to know how to reactivate your being potential, which are true magnets for success, I invite you to our upcoming Science Potential live show. And I have included the link for free participation in the show notes of this podcast. Now, let's get to the topic. Your brain has a fascinating ability, and it seems to protect you from pain by blocking out certain truths. I call this phenomenon truth repression. It is something your brain does automatically. Your mind prefers to hold on to a familiar image, in this case of yourself, even if this self-image no longer corresponds to reality or may even be harmful to you. For example, when you are convinced that you are not good enough or have other self-critical beliefs about yourself ingrained, yes, we are familiar with that. We often refer to it as our inner critic. But we repeatedly feel that something within us wants to push us back to such an old self-image. And this repression of truth acts like a shield that wants to protect you from changes, but also from uncomfortable truths, yes, or insights. And this repression of truth maintains the image of yourself that you once created at some point in time. For most of us, this happens out of fear, pain, or even from old wounds. But even if this image no longer corresponds to your current development, it can still keep you trapped. You start to deceive yourself in order to protect the self-image that has been established. This usually happens quite unconsciously. These self-deceptions act as a protective mechanism that helps you avoid unpleasant realizations and confrontations in the short term. But this repression leads to further self-deceptions and creates a chain of blockages that anchor and hold your life to a very specific vibrational frequency. And that makes it impossible for you to improve your reality. Ultimately, it also prevents you from awakening. You probably know this. You may have been working on yourself for years, and you know what you want to change about yourself, what you want to overcome, what you want to get rid of. Or there is something inside you that wants to come out, but you just can't reach it or can't seem to get it right once and for all. Perhaps you find yourself in a life situation that suddenly no longer feels right for you, yet you still hold on to it, whether consciously or unconsciously. Even though you might be doing a lot to improve your life, it feels like you are constantly working in the wrong areas. When you look at the results, and that may be because your brain is trying to preserve your self-image, even when it is not truly beneficial for you. And the pattern of truth repression also hinders you, for example, from distinguishing between truth and lies. It keeps you trapped in unhealthy patterns, whether in relationships, in your career, or in your inner life. And. I recently worked with a client whom I would like to briefly tell you about. She was firmly convinced that she was constantly experiencing mishaps, that she was clumsy, felt like a bull in a china shop, and spread chaos everywhere. Yes, and she playfully dismissed all her beliefs with humor and laughed the loudest about herself. And I tell you, it was really funny with this woman. That was funny. But she smiled away all her disappointments, all her wounds, and all her personal needs, as if to excuse them. Yes, the result was that she was always a welcome class clown with a chaotic lifestyle. This was really funny for everyone around her. She was not taken seriously, always somewhat ridiculed, and her boundaries were not respected at all. Her financial situation has become quite threatening as a result. And in a partnership, I tell you, she was exploited to such an extent. 2001, I have never experienced anything like that. And she smiled. The customer responded to everything with a smile and was even proud of taking everything with humor and seeing the good in everything. That was indeed a very striking delusion. Yes. And what was super interesting was that this was actually the only lever through which she first recognized that she needed to change something about herself. The interesting thing was that her daughter presented herself as highly aggressive in life, thus taking on the responsibility for the mother's unexpressed anger. The client has been a prime example of the pattern of truth repression and self-deception. And she has not only harmed herself in a life-threatening way, but indeed also her daughter, because she could not live her own life at all, or rather, I should say, we are on the way to understanding this. She lived in a way that represented her mother's anger, and thus she only ran through her life in a state of rage and aggression, ruining her own life in the process. Find a job in 2001 if you are such a terror snail. Find a partner if you are such a terror snail. Try to find really good friends when you are always aggressive and in a bad mood. Yes, and the exciting thing is that now, as this client changes within herself and comes into her truth, the daughter automatically changes as well, even though I am not working with her at all. Yes, it's super fascinating. This dynamic is an extreme example. You know that from me. Listen to the examples. Apply them to yourself. Yes. Self-deception may seem like a protection at first glance, but it will prevent you from truly healing. For every time you avoid an uncomfortable truth, you create a new barrier between yourself and your true being. And these blockages prevent freedom, ease, and also your spiritual awakening. It feels as if you are constantly trapped in the same cycle, unable to take the truly next essential step. But the more you become aware of this dynamic, the sooner you can begin to break down the walls of self-deception. It requires a bit of courage because it means honestly confronting yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. But it is precisely in this process that your liberation ultimately lies. It's actually logical, isn't it? This means letting go of the fear of confronting uncomfortable truths and bravely facing reality. Exciting, the word reality and spiritual awakening. Everything is interconnected, yes. So if someone thinks that my spiritual awakening only takes place in fairy dust or in some subtle realms like consciousness expansion, all just in the subtle, they are mistaken, because you always have the reflection level over reality. Yes, you are now allowed to recognize and let go of your patterns of self-deception. While your brain may want to protect you from pain, it also keeps you in a state of stagnation. If you do not question these protective mechanisms, that is the first thing to address. And no, 2001, you are not alone with this issue, as almost the entire so-called modern world is affected by it. Just take a look around. Everywhere you see conformists, yes-sayers, truth repressors, egoists, narcissists, and so on and so forth. Sometimes this is even regulated by the state, you know. And now you have the chance to truly break free. Yes. And that is super exciting. And, you know, I am now really receiving quite a few messages, including private messages, from people who say they can no longer stand hearing about awakening. I understand. I have even thought about whether I actually want to use the word anymore. But the fact is, it is exactly what is happening. Yes. A spiritual awakening is taking place through all these themes in our lives. Recently, a client a participant here in our community, wrote to me that she can no longer stand always having to wait for the spiritual awakening. Always having to wait for the spiritual awakening. No, of course, don't wait. Nothing will come. You have to come. Yes, you are allowed to take the path. And that is really, really, really important. And while we're at it, I also receive a lot of very attentive messages or sometimes comments here that some people are bothered by the fact that I promote our free live show in my free podcast. Yes, please people, I am passionate about the topic. I am passionate about what I do, and it all has to do with what we are talking about. And of course, I will invite people to continue the journey with me. You are adults. Just ignore it. Yes, do yourselves a favor. If you find the content itself cool, just overlook that part. And I can, look at how many views we always get on a post in a podcast episode. Just imagine if I had to take into account every individual's feelings, then I wouldn't even know where to start. Yes, my truth, which is also important. For the content I produce is that it is extremely important for me to point out that this is not just about the dramas in the world and not just about the dramas in your personal world, but that there is a fundamental process behind it for you. And that is the process of spiritual awakening. You can also call it completely unspiritual. Growing up, yes, taking responsibility. Understanding higher connections. Taking responsibility for yourself and your knowledge, your truth, your way of life, and translating it in a way that feels right for you. And yet, in my opinion, the content of what we are discussing remains extremely valuable. Yes? Okay, thank you for allowing me to say this, because I didn't want to leave it uncommented, but I also don't want to justify myself permanently in private messages. That's why we're doing it publicly here. Perhaps one or two others have thought the same without writing it down. Yes, okay. Let's start to lovingly dissolve these mechanisms and recognize that we no longer have to live a life based on self-images and fears that simply no longer fit us. For we all have the ability to rise above these patterns and thus confront our own truth, and your being potentials, which will also come to light as a result, are just waiting to be activated by you. Again. Yes, once again. The invitation to the show. Now, at this threshold of new beginnings, you are allowed to decide not to let your life be governed any longer by false beliefs and inner blockages. You have the opportunity to free yourself from the repression of truth and, yes, to step into the self-assertion of 2001 and into your inner truth. This will be a process that may take some time. That's not what it's about at all. Because ultimately, every small step towards honesty with yourself is a huge step towards your true being. Yes, and I tell you, self-deception is a burden, and you can let it go in favor of the truths that have long been within you. You don't even have to find it. We often hear things like, I don't know, I can't find my calling, or this, that, or whatever. I don't really know what I want or where I should go, and I have no goals or whatever. It is all within you, but it is simply kept down through the repression of truth, like a beach ball that is inflated and you are constantly pushing underwater. At some point it becomes exhausting when you have to keep it below the surface of the water your entire life. Then, eventually, it will turn into strength. Yes? And if you just stop doing that, then these truths can pop up like a beach ball. And then you can look at them and play with them. Okay, so we will see each other in our live show. From the heart, all the best for you. Your sister in spirit, your Linda.